The ballroom smelled like roses and expensive candles. Glasses clinked around me, music floated above the crowd, and laughter bounced off the high ceilings. I stood near the back, holding a glass of water I hadn't touched, watching the dance floor fill with people I had known my whole life. Then I saw her. My sister Diane was spinning in a white wedding gown, her dark hair pinned up with tiny pearls. She was glowing. She was laughing. And the man holding her hands, guiding her across the floor with that easy smile I had once loved more than anything, that was Marcus. My Marcus. The man I had been engaged to for 14 months. My fork hit the floor. I didn't notice until someone near me gasped. The room tilted. My chest felt like someone had pressed a heavy stone directly against it. I couldn't breathe properly. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the two of them, dancing like they had always belonged together, like I had never existed at all. Someone touched my shoulder. "Nathan, are you all right?" I wasn't. I was 32 years old, a project manager at a mid-sized design firm, someone who double-checked everything, planned carefully, and trusted slowly. And I had still walked straight into this. I stepped outside through a side door before anyone could stop me. The night air was cool and sharp, and I stood on the stone steps breathing slowly until my hands stopped shaking. I am not an impulsive person. That is probably the most important thing to understand about me. I don't shout. I don't throw things. I don't react before I think. It's not because I don't feel things deeply, I do. It's because I learned early that the person who stays calm always wins, and the person who loses control always loses everything else along with it. So I stood there, counting my breaths, staring at the dark garden in front of me. What I had just seen wasn't a surprise, not really. Not deep down. There had been signs for months. I had told myself I was imagining it. I had believed that because it was easier than accepting the truth, that my sister and my fiancé had been building something behind my back, and while they built it, they had also been carefully, methodically dismantling my reputation. They had convinced nearly everyone in my family that I was the problem. The unstable one. The jealous one. The difficult one. Now they were married. And they believed it was over. They were wrong. I thought about the past year while I stood in that garden. The memories came in pieces, but once I started arranging them in order, the pattern was impossible to miss. Last Christmas, Diane had sat beside my mother at dinner and quietly said she was worried about Nathan. She said I seemed controlling. She said Marcus had mentioned feeling pressured. She said it gently, with a concerned look on her face, the way someone does when they want to plant a seed without appearing to dig the hole themselves. At the New Year's party, Marcus had arrived 2 hours late and told me he'd been at a work function. 3 weeks later, I found a photo on a mutual friend's old Instagram story, Marcus and Diane at a rooftop bar that same night, laughing, her hand on his arm. When I brought it up, he said I was reading too much into things. Diane said I had always been possessive. My mother looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. In February, I missed a family dinner because of a work deadline. Diane told everyone I hadn't come because I was angry at Marcus again. I hadn't known there was a dinner. Each moment alone felt small. Together, they formed something ugly and deliberate. They had been writing a story about me, and I hadn't even known I was a character in it. Here is something that people don't always understand about betrayal. The worst part isn't the moment you discover it. The worst part is realizing how long it had already been happening before you knew. Every memory you thought was real starts to crack. You replay moments and suddenly you're not sure what was genuine and what was performance. But here is also what I knew about myself. I was careful. I kept records. Not because I suspected anyone at the time, I did it because it was simply my nature. Project managers document everything. It's instinct. I had emails going back 18 months. I had text message threads saved to a cloud folder. I had a small notebook in my desk drawer at home where I'd written dates, times, and what was said during conversations that felt off to me. At the time, I had told myself I was just being organized. Now I understood I had been building a case without knowing I needed one. I also had something else. 3 colleagues and 2 old friends had reached out to me over the past several months, separately and privately, to say they had seen things that seemed strange. That Marcus had been seen with Diane more than once in situations that didn't quite fit the explanations given. That something didn't feel right. I had thanked them and filed it away. Now I was going to use it. I went back inside the reception. Not because I was ready to confront anyone, I wasn't. Not yet. I went back inside because disappearing would have looked exactly like what Diane and Marcus had told everyone I was, unstable and emotional. So I found my seat. I picked up my fork. I ate the salmon on my plate. When people came to check on me, I smiled and said the salmon was excellent. When my cousin Felix, a loud, good-natured man of 40, clapped me on the back and said rough night, mate, I nodded pleasantly and said I was fine. Inside, I was building a list. I watched Diane across the room. She moved through the crowd with total ease, accepting hugs, accepting congratulations, touching Marcus's arm every time she passed him. She never looked in my direction. That told me she had expected me either not to come or to make a scene if I did. I had come. I had not made a scene. And now she was uncertain. I could tell by the way she laughed just a little too loudly whenever she was closest to my side of the room. Marcus, on the other hand, caught my eye once. Just once. Something moved across his face, not guilt, exactly. More like calculation. He looked away quickly. Good. Let them wonder. Wondering was exactly where I needed them. The week after the wedding, a letter arrived at my office. It was from a lawyer, not mine. It was from a firm representing a property investment group, and it outlined a financial arrangement that involved 3 signatures, including mine, on a joint investment agreement signed 11 months ago. The problem was that the figures in the letter did not match the figures in my copy of the agreement. Someone had altered the numbers after signing. I sat at my desk for a long time, reading the letter twice, then 3 times. Then I called my own lawyer, a precise and thorough woman named Patricia Osei, who had handled a property dispute for me 2 years earlier. I told her what I had. I scanned everything and sent it to her within the hour. She called me back the next morning. Nathan, she said carefully, if what you're showing me is accurate, this is serious. The original figures and the amended figures represent a significant difference. Someone misrepresented this agreement. I asked her who had signed alongside me. She read the names back. Marcus. And Diane. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. They hadn't just taken my relationship and my reputation. They had reached into my finances too. Their arrogance was even larger than I had estimated. That was their biggest mistake. My family is not small. There are aunts, uncles, cousins spread across 2 cities, and my mother sits at the center of all of it like a quiet sun. She doesn't shout or demand loyalty. She simply observes, and people naturally orbit her. My mother had not attended the wedding. She had told me she wasn't feeling well. I hadn't pushed. But the day after I received the lawyer's letter, I went to her house for Sunday lunch, just the 2 of us, and I told her calmly that I needed to share some things with her. She listened without interrupting, which is something she does very well. When I finished, she was quiet for almost a full minute. Then she said, I've had questions, Nathan. Things that didn't sit right. I didn't want to upset you. I told her I understood, and that I wasn't there to upset anyone. I was there to make sure she had accurate information before things moved forward. She asked me what I was planning. I told her I was planning nothing dramatic. I was planning something careful. She nodded slowly and refilled my tea. It wasn't an endorsement, but it wasn't resistance either. My mother is a woman who values truth over comfort. She always has been. That was why Diane had worked so hard to control the information that reached her. Now that control had a hole in it. I called Diane the following Tuesday. I kept my voice completely neutral, like I was making a routine check-in. I asked how the honeymoon plans were going. She was cautious at first, then slowly relaxed into the conversation, which was exactly what I needed. Near the end, I said, very calmly, I've been going through the investment paperwork from last year. I noticed something strange in the figures. Do you remember signing that? A pause. Short but real. Of course, she said. Why? I just want to make sure my copy matches yours, I said. Patricia is helping me get everything organized. Another pause. Longer this time. Who is Patricia? She asked. My lawyer, I said pleasantly. You'd like her. Very thorough. I let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds, then told her I had to go and ended the call. I sat for a moment and thought about her face on the other end of the line, the face I couldn't see but could hear in every careful, measured breath she took before answering. She was worried now. She would tell Marcus. Marcus would panic quietly, the way he always did when things moved outside his control. They would begin checking their own records, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much I could prove. The answer was, more than they imagined. Marcus made his first mistake 2 weeks later at a birthday dinner for my cousin Felix. I had been invited because Felix invites everyone, loudly and without thought for awkwardness, which I respected enormously about him. Marcus was there with Diane. We were civil. We were polite. The table was large enough that we sat at different ends, which suited everyone. But toward the end of the evening, Marcus had had 2 glasses of wine too many, and he said something to the group near him that carried further than he intended. Nathan never really knew what was going on, he said, laughing lightly. He thought everything was fine right up until it wasn't. He wasn't speaking to me. But I heard it. And so did Felix's partner, Annette, who was sitting directly to my left. And so did 2 other people at that end of the table, both of whom looked at me quickly and then away. I did not change my expression. I took a sip of water and continued my conversation with Felix about football. But my phone was in my jacket pocket, and before Marcus had finished laughing, I had pressed record. I let him talk. He said 2 more careless things over the next 10 minutes. The recording picked up all of it clearly. His confidence was going to be the rope he tied around his own situation. I didn't go to the next family gathering alone. I invited my old university friend, a calm and observant man named Philip, who had met Marcus several times over the years and had been one of the people who quietly reached out to me months ago. Philip had seen Marcus and Diane together at a restaurant in March, the same month Marcus had told me he was spending that weekend with his brother in Edinburgh. Philip had thought little of it at the time, but after the wedding, he had put it together. At the gathering, Philip was simply himself, friendly, easy to talk to, someone everyone liked. But he listened carefully. And when Marcus made a comment about how Nathan had always had trouble trusting people, Philip, who had been nodding along, asked a very innocent question. When did that start, do you think? Marcus stumbled. He gave a vague answer. Philip nodded politely and asked a follow-up question that was even more innocent and even more precise. By the end of the exchange, 3 people at the table had heard Marcus contradict himself twice without Philip raising his voice once. Afterward, outside, Philip looked at me and said, "He panics when he doesn't have a script." I nodded. I already knew that. But now others were beginning to see it too. My Aunt Rosalind called me on a Thursday evening. She is my father's older sister, sharp and direct, someone Diane had always been particularly warm toward at family events. She had been at the wedding and had sent them a generous gift. She said, "Nathan, I have to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer honestly." I told her to go ahead. Did you and Marcus have a serious falling out before he met Diane, or is the timeline not what I was told? I asked her what she had been told. She described a version of events where Marcus and I had already ended things mutually over a year before he and Diane became close, that Diane had waited respectfully and that I had become bitter after the fact and started causing problems. I let her finish. Then I said, quietly, "Rosalind, Marcus proposed to me in October. 14 months ago. I have the photos, the messages, and the ring receipt. I can send you any of it." The silence on her end was long and full. "Send me the photos," she said finally. I did, within 2 minutes. I also sent her a screenshot of a message Marcus had sent me in December, 4 months after the proposal, that said simply, "Can't wait to spend Christmas with you. Love you." Rosalind didn't call back that night. But she called the next morning, and her voice was different. Diane tried to reach me twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail. The first message was breezy, almost cheerful. She just wanted to catch up and hoped there were no hard feelings. The second was more careful, mentioning that she had heard I was asking questions about paperwork and that she wanted to clear things up before anything got complicated. That second message was important. I saved it alongside everything else. I also noticed a small but telling shift at my workplace. A colleague mentioned that someone had called the office asking general questions about my role and responsibilities. It was framed as a reference inquiry, but I hadn't listed anyone from Diane's circle as a contact, and the questions described were not the type a professional reference check would ask. I told Patricia. She made a note of it. Meanwhile, Felix rang me and said, with his usual straightforwardness, that Aunt Rosalind had spoken to 2 other family members and things were getting interesting. He didn't ask for details. He just said, "Whatever you're doing, Nathan, keep doing it." I wasn't doing anything dramatic. I was simply allowing the truth to move at its own pace, with a little help. Every gentle question I had planted was beginning to grow. Doubt, once it starts, is very difficult to fully stop. Diane and Marcus had spent months planting doubt about me. I was now returning the favor with something they didn't have on their side. Evidence. The first genuinely public moment came at a Sunday brunch my mother hosted, which she does every few months for the wider family. She hadn't cancelled it despite everything, which told me she was ready for things to move forward. Diane and Marcus came. So did Rosalind, Felix, Annette, and several others. It was crowded and warm and full of the usual noise. Near the end of brunch, I asked Marcus a simple question in front of the table. I kept my voice relaxed and curious, the way you might ask about the weather. "Marcus, do you still have your copy of the investment summary from the Alderton Group? Patricia needs a reference point for the figures." He stopped mid-sentence in a different conversation. "Just for a second. I'd have to look for it," he said. "Of course," I said pleasantly. "No rush. She just needs it before the 15th. I turned back to my conversation with Rosalind. But I could feel the temperature at Marcus's end of the table shift. Diane reached over and touched his hand. It was a small gesture, meant to be subtle. It was not subtle. Rosalind, sitting directly across from me, saw it. She looked at me carefully, then looked back at her plate. She didn't ask me anything then. But after brunch, as people were leaving, she stopped beside me at the door and said quietly, "How long have you known about the figures?" "Long enough," I said. Philip was not the only ally I had been cultivating carefully. There was also a woman named Sandra, who had worked alongside Marcus at his previous company before he joined his current firm. Sandra and I had met twice at industry events over the years and stayed loosely connected online. Sandra had reached out to me 6 weeks after the wedding, not to gossip, but because she had her own reasons to be wary of Marcus. She had witnessed him misrepresent figures on a project at their old firm, nothing that ever reached a formal complaint, but something she had never forgotten. She was willing to speak, carefully and factually, to Patricia if needed. Not as an accusation, but as a pattern of behavior that supported what the documents already showed. I thanked her and told her I hoped it wouldn't come to that, but that I was grateful she was willing. With Sandra, Philip, Rosalind, Felix, and Annette all in different positions around the situation, I had something Diane and Marcus hadn't accounted for. They had focused entirely on controlling the family narrative. They had not considered that I had a wider circle than they remembered. They had underestimated me because they thought I was alone. That was the mistake people who rely on deception always make. They assume that because you stayed quiet, you stayed still. Patricia called me on a Wednesday with news I had been expecting but still felt when I heard it. She had compared both versions of the investment document, mine and the copy obtained through the legal process, and the differences were confirmed. The figures had been altered after the original signing. The alteration favored Marcus and Diane's share of the return by a margin of roughly £18,000. "This is document fraud, Nathan," Patricia said. "I want to be precise about that." I asked what the next steps were. She said she would be sending a formal letter to their address outlining the discrepancy and requesting a response within 21 days. She would copy the investment group's own legal representative. When the letter arrived at their home, Marcus and Diane would know exactly how serious things had become. No more wondering what I knew. No more estimating how much I could prove. They would have it in writing, on legal letterhead, from a qualified solicitor. I told Patricia to send it. Then I sat at my kitchen table for a few minutes, drinking tea and thinking about the two of them receiving that letter. Thinking about the moment they realized that the careful, quiet, unstable man they had dismissed and deceived had been 3 steps ahead of them for months. I felt very calm. Not happy. Calm. A few days after Patricia sent the letter, I met with Rosalind for coffee. She had asked to see me privately, which I took as a good sign. She brought up the wedding herself. She told me she had noticed things that day that she had pushed aside, small moments that seemed odd, how Diane had steered certain family members away from conversations with me, how Marcus had seemed tense rather than joyful during the ceremony, how quickly the event had moved past any moment that might have given me space to speak. I told her about the trip Marcus had claimed to take in March, and about Philip seeing him with Diane that same weekend. I told her about the Christmas dinner comment, and how I only learned about the dinner afterward. I told her about the workplace inquiry. With each thing I shared, I watched Rosalind's expression settle into something harder and more certain. She had known Diane her whole life. She had watched her grow up. This was not easy for her. I thought she was protecting herself from a difficult situation, Rosalind said finally. I didn't realize she was constructing one. I didn't say anything harsh about Diane. I didn't need to. I simply let the facts speak, and let Rosalind reach her own conclusions. She was a fair woman. I had always trusted that about her. By the end of the coffee, she had offered to speak to my mother directly. Diane came to my flat unannounced on a Saturday morning. I opened the door, stepped aside to let her in, and offered her tea. She declined. She was angry. I could see it in the tight way she held her jaw, but she was trying to manage it. That was new. For most of our adult lives, Diane had never bothered managing her emotions around me. I had always been safe to dismiss. "You're trying to destroy my marriage," she said. "I'm trying to recover money that was taken from me," I said. "That's all. You never cared about that investment." "I signed it," I said. "That means I cared enough." She shifted her approach. She told me the family was upset. That my mother was distressed. That people were choosing sides over something that should have stayed private. I told her, very gently, that I hadn't chosen to make it complicated. I had simply stopped pretending it wasn't. She looked at me for a long time. There was something in her expression I hadn't seen before, not guilt exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in a long while and realizing she had misjudged what she was dealing with. "Nathan," she said quietly. "What do you want?" "The truth," I said. In front of the people who were told otherwise. She left without answering. But she didn't slam the door. 2 days after Diane's visit, someone I hadn't expected contacted me. His name was Owen, and he had been Marcus's closest friend since university. I had met him a handful of times over the years and always found him decent and straightforward. Owen said he needed to meet me in person. We met at a coffee shop near his office on a Tuesday afternoon. He told me something that made the whole picture sharper. He said that before the wedding, Marcus had confided in him that he wasn't sure he was doing the right thing. That he had feelings for Diane, yes, but that he also felt, and Owen used Marcus's own word here, trapped. That by the time Owen heard about the wedding plans, things had already moved far past the point where Marcus felt he could reverse them. Owen hadn't known about the financial documents. When I told him, briefly and factually, his expression tightened. "He told me it was mutual with you and him," Owen said quietly. "He said you'd both agreed to go your separate ways." "We were engaged," I said. I had not agreed to anything. Owen looked down at his coffee for a long time. He wasn't a witness in any formal sense, and I didn't need him to be. But what he confirmed was the final piece I had been waiting for, that Marcus had been rewriting the story long before the wedding, even to his closest friend. The deception wasn't reactive. It was planned. Patricia received a response from Marcus and Diane's solicitor within the 21-day window. It was carefully worded and denied any intentional alteration, claiming instead that the discrepancy was an administrative error during the final draft process. Patricia forwarded it to me with a short note. They're going to argue it was a mistake. This is standard. It doesn't weaken our position. I wasn't surprised. I had expected them to deny it. What I had not expected was the accompanying message, a personal email sent directly to me from Marcus, not through the lawyers. It arrived the same day as the legal response. He wrote that he was sorry for the way things had happened, that he had cared about me and that he had not handled things well, that he hoped we could settle everything quietly and without making things worse for everyone. It was a calculated message dressed in the language of sincerity. He was hoping I would interpret it as remorse and soften. He was hoping I would settle privately, keep everything small, and let the narrative he and Diane had built remain mostly intact. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Patricia and told her to continue. There was no quiet settlement that preserved only some of the truth. The family had been told a specific story about me. That story needed to be corrected, not through anger, but through facts, clearly and fully presented. I spent that week being very deliberate about what I did not do. I did not call Marcus back. I did not contact Diane. I did not post anything publicly or speak carelessly to anyone who might carry information back to them. I had been building this steadily and carefully, and I wasn't going to rush it now when I was closest to the end. But I did do one thing. I wrote down, in precise and factual language, everything that had happened from the beginning: dates, conversations, documents, witnesses. The full account. I wrote it as a timeline, not as an emotional letter. It ran to 4 pages and was as dry and careful as a project report. I sent it to Patricia. I also, after consideration, sent a copy to my mother and to Rosalind, with a short note explaining that I wanted them to have the full picture before the upcoming family anniversary brunch that Marcus and Diane had organized for the following Saturday. I had known about that brunch for 2 weeks. I had agreed to attend when Felix invited me, before everything had accelerated with the lawyers. I had not cancelled. Diane and Marcus had organized the brunch to celebrate their first month of marriage. They had chosen it as a moment to re-establish themselves at the center of the family, happy, settled, untroubled. It was meant to close the chapter. I intended to let them have their brunch. I simply intended to also be there. The brunch was held at a private room in a restaurant Diane had always liked. Round tables, good light, about 20 family members and close friends. It felt deliberately festive, like she had put real effort into making it look like nothing was wrong. I arrived on time. I greeted people warmly. I sat down, ordered coffee, and made conversation about ordinary things. Marcus watched me from the moment I walked in. He was trying to gauge my mood without appearing to. Diane was more practiced. She moved through the room naturally, though I noticed she took the long route around my table each time. Midway through the meal, during a lull in the conversation, I reached into my jacket and placed a single folded document on the table in front of me. I didn't open it immediately. I just set it there. The people nearest to me noticed. Conversation quieted slightly. Then I said, very calmly, to no one in particular and everyone at once, I've been working through some paperwork with my solicitor. I wanted to share something with the family, since you've all been so kind through what's been a complicated few months for everyone. I opened the document. It was a summary, clear, simple, 1 page, of the financial discrepancy and the legal process now underway. I slid it toward the center of the table. Diane's face went the color of the white tablecloth. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something real has just happened. Marcus tried first. He said the document was out of context, that it was a misunderstanding being addressed through the proper channels, that this wasn't the time or place. I agreed with him that it wasn't a perfect setting. I said so pleasantly. Then I said that since the family had been given one version of events for a long time, it seemed fair that they now had access to the documented version. My mother, sitting 2 seats away from me, said nothing. But she had read the timeline I sent her. Her expression was not surprised. Rosalind, across the table, asked one clear, direct question to Marcus. Did you alter this agreement? Marcus said the matter was with solicitors. Rosalind said, "That is not what I asked." The table waited. 20 people, all watching Marcus, all waiting for an answer he couldn't give cleanly without either admitting it or lying in front of the full family. He chose a third option. He stood up, told Diane they should go, and reached for his jacket. Diane didn't move immediately. She sat very still, looking at the document in the center of the table. Then she looked at me. Her expression was difficult to describe. It wasn't anger anymore, and it wasn't the easy confidence she had carried for months. It was something smaller. Something that looked, finally, like being caught. They left. The room sat in silence for a long moment. Then Felix, true to form, said well, and poured himself more orange juice, and something loosened slightly. People began talking. Not loudly, not dramatically. This was a family, not a courtroom. But the conversations that had been managed carefully for months were now happening openly. Rosalind spoke to my mother. Annette spoke to 2 cousins. Philip, who had been invited by Felix and sat quietly in the corner, answered questions when asked. I stayed at the table and drank my coffee. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't cried. I hadn't accused anyone with loaded language or demanded that people choose sides. I had placed a document on a table and let it do what documents do. Over the following days, several family members reached out to me privately. Some apologized for believing the version of events they had been sold. Some were simply checking in. A few were angry, not at me, but at what they now understood had been done, and at how easily they had been guided toward a false picture. I was patient with all of them. I told each one that I understood, and that I didn't blame them for trusting someone they loved. The legal matter continued moving through its process. Patricia was confident. I had stopped checking my phone every hour waiting for updates. The pressure that had sat in my chest since that ballroom had finally begun to lift. 3 weeks after the brunch, Marcus and Diane's solicitor made contact with Patricia again. The tone of the letter was different this time. Less firm. More willing to discuss resolution. Patricia told me they were looking for a settlement. She advised me to consider it, since litigation would cost both sides significantly and the outcome, while likely in my favor, was never entirely certain. She laid out the options clearly and let me decide. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I said yes to a settlement, on the condition that the agreed figures were fair, that the settlement was documented in full, and that a written acknowledgement of the discrepancy was included. Not a public statement. Not a dramatic confession. Simply a legal record that said clearly what had happened. They agreed. I called Patricia after it was finalized and thanked her. She told me I had been a very organized client, and said it as though it were the highest compliment she could offer, which for Patricia it probably was. I also called my mother that evening. We talked for nearly an hour, not about Diane and Marcus, but about other things, a family trip she was planning, a book she was reading, a question she had about her laptop. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation that feels like an exhale after a long time holding your breath. Toward the end of the call, she said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I told her she didn't need to be. Months passed. The legal matter was closed. The family had recalibrated around the truth the way families do, quietly, imperfectly, over time. Some relationships healed. Some were simply different now, not broken, but changed in permanent ways. That was fair. That was honest. I ran into Diane once, outside a supermarket, on a grey Tuesday afternoon. We stood for a moment looking at each other. She didn't look the way she had at the brunch. She looked tired. Human-sized. "How are you?" she asked. "Good," I said. Genuinely. She nodded. We didn't say anything else of importance. We went our separate ways. I thought about her later that evening. Not with bitterness, which surprised me slightly. Mostly with a kind of tired clarity. She was my sister. She had done something that caused real damage. Both of those things were true and would probably always be true simultaneously. Marcus I didn't see. I suspected that was intentional on his part, and I didn't mind. What I carried away from all of it, the part that stayed with me clearly and consistently, was this: staying calm is not the same as doing nothing. Patience is not the same as weakness. And the person who quietly documents, builds, and waits is almost never the person that the louder, faster, more confident opponent is watching carefully enough. I had been careful my whole life. For one long and painful year, that carefulness had been used against me. Then I used it for myself. That felt like enough.